Hello and welcome to Blockchain Gaming World with me, John Jordan. So, diving back into the world of DigiDaigaku and trying to make sense of sort of what's going on there. It's a moving process, uh, there's a certain level of uncertainty, I suppose, if we can say it that way. But let's sort of start out where we are and let's see what assets are live, and let's see perhaps where we're going and what we might learn from this situation. So let's start off and look at some NFTs. So the current situation we are in is that we're going through the process of having these. Well, basically, the end point is we're creating villains. So we're creating villain and supervillain NFTs, and these go alongside the hero characters that were the first characters to be created from the Genesis characters. And we also have the dragons that are coming this weekend with the Super Bowl. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, but I thought there's some interesting game theory around here, or at least there's some interesting frameworks around the game theory. So there are these villain potions, and there are some super villain potions. So these were created earlier in January, and these are then required to create the villains. So these are not necessary. These are sort of like modifiers, I suppose. To create a villain, you need some of these masked villain NFTs. So these are just sort of generic. As far as we can tell, they are. There's no reason to buy one over another. These are just sort of required. They're almost like tickets. They're just like an entry ticket, really. And then what you combine, when you combine one of these with either a super potion, a super villain potion, or a villain potion, it's the traits of this potion that then create the villain that you get in the end. And sort of what's interesting about this is that the masked villains, there are many more of those NFTs. There's many more of these NFTs than there are of the potions. So the potions were sort of something that were created for the holders of the Genesis NFTs and the Hero NFTs. So basically people who had already sort of got into the project, bought into the project, or been part of the original mint. They got these villain potions for free. And also they'd also got masked potions for free as well. But the point was there were many more of these masked villain NFTs created. So there was the sort of allocation that went to the original holders of the NFTs, and then there was a sort of bigger allocation that went to just people on the whitelist. So the whole point of these sort of NFT projects is over time you want to sort of increase the audience. If you're just giving NFTs to the people who were in there to begin with, that doesn't really take you very far. So I'll try to put this all down in a spreadsheet. Won't go into all the details here, but basically there was the Genesis characters. They were created 2021 of those, and then there were heroes. So there was obviously a potential total of the same as the Genesis. In fact, there at the moment, at least, there's only 1,900 of those. So there's a sort of a shortfall, and that's because there's these spirit tokens which haven't, which you basically you get a spirit token. If you had a Genesis, you got given a spirit, and then you burn the spirit to get the hero. So some of these spirits haven't been burnt to create these heroes. So there's a sort of there's slightly fewer heroes than the sort of the total supply. So 94% of the potential heroes have been created, but 7% are still spirits. So when it comes down to these sort of potions and villains, actually, so we can take this off here. So actually, it looks like masked villains were about 8,100-ish. So depending on looking at sort of what's there, you get slightly different figures from OpenSea and from Blur. So if we go to Blur, I think here someone was suggesting I should look at Blur more often. So here we go. This is the DigiDaigaku masked villain. So this is the total supply of these ones, and this is saying 8,109. So basically, broadly speaking, you can see we've sort of gone from 2,000 to 2,000 to sort of 8,000. So that's sort of the expansion of the audience. Now, the bit where the game theory comes in is that basically anyone with one of these masked villains can just effectively burn that NFT. So you can take one of these, you basically send it to a contract, and the lowest level you get one of these. This is just a villain. This is the lowest level of villain character. So potentially all these masked characters can end up as these sort of low-level villains. But there is something else you can do. So you can take your masked NFT and combine it with one of these villain potions, and then you get a slightly different class. So there's these little brothers, and then there's these big brothers. So if we click on here, we'll get to see the art of the big brothers. If it's going to, yeah, okay. So you can see these are different art styles. So every one of the villains has a different art style. So there's actually not very many of these, only 40 of these, which actually means their price is obviously much higher than the little brothers because there's much fewer of them. Whether that's going to stay, we'll have to wait and see, because as I say, we're in the middle of the sort of process, so we don't really know. Potentially there are, potentially there's only 89 villain potions that look like they're live at the moment. So there's only 89 extra big villains that could be created. There's only 38 at the moment. So actually the big villains are actually going to be, even though they're not rare in terms of the rarity traits, there's going to be fewer of those than anything else. In some ways, they're going to be sort of the most rare in terms of frequency. Also, we've not seen, not many little villains have been created, only 534 of those, even though we know there of the 8,100, there's still like almost 6,000 masked NFTs still around. So there are, let's say, about 8,000 of these, 6,000 of these knocking around, and anyone can just buy one of these and then create one of those villains. In this case, if you didn't use a potion, you get a little brother. You need to also get a potion buy a potion to get a big brother. And then at the top end of the scale, you get the super villains. So these are what happens if you take a masked NFT and you combine it with a super villain potion. So the rarities and the traits of the super villain potion are what will create this super villain. So again, there's various forms. So we have, let's go down here. So we have the villain class. So we have the third in command are these ones. So again, there's fewer of these. These are female characters. So theoretically, these should be cheaper, but they're not that much cheaper at the moment. There's only 94 of those. There's a second in commands, which are the sort of floor at the moment. There are these ones. Again, female characters, but this time face on. So there's only 334 of those, and they are, much more expensive than the first two. And then there's these very high-end ones, which are sort of the super artwork, and you can see there's only two of those for sale. So that's sort of the different class system you get, and this rarity is dependent on which supervillain potion you use. So that's the basic sort of idea of what's going on here. So coming back to the game theory, what's sort of interesting, if you think about where we are, we still have this sort of big unknown here. So there are loads of these masked NFTs, which could just all become little villains. There's only this amount of villain potions which could then sort of increase this level. So this percentage here is a sort of an idea of how many potentially could be minted. So potentially there could only be this number, 500 little villains, could potentially only be the 8% of what could be there. So 92% may still come. The big villains, these may only be 30% of what may come. Obviously, we don't really know exactly how many we minted out. And the super villains, they're sort of limited by how many super villain potions are there. So it's sort of about 50-50. Super villain potions here. So it's sort of 50-50 on that. So there's a bit of quite a lot of uncertainty. We know from the heroes situation, probably not everything will be minted out. So there'll be some of the potential probably get up to 90%. But there is this sort of interesting situation, particularly here with these big villains, because these are actually, if you want to get one of those and you don't have a villain, if you don't have a villain potion, you have to go and get one. And the price of these is actually quite high, really, even certainly compared to the little villain. But we sort of know there might be a lot of these sort of being created. So we can sort of go, if we were coming into this project, without holding any assets, if we wanted to create a supervillain, how much would that cost us? Well, to create a supervillain, we'd need a supervillain potion, and we'd also need a masked villain. So if I got this right, the price is supervillain potion, floor price there. So we get the floor price here. The create price, sorry, that's buying it, and the current floor price. So if we could buy these NFTs, there would obviously be a gas fee as well. We could create something. And this is the ETH cost now. So potentially, if we could create this, ignoring gas, which is actually quite low at the moment, and we could sell it for the floor price, we could actually make $600 potentially. That's some sort of idea of what's going on there. You probably wouldn't make that because, if there is that money to be made, people will be coming into this trade and doing that. So over time, you'd imagine this was sort of going to zero. The interesting bit, I guess, is the big villain cost. So here, you need a villain potion and a masked villain. So you're paying 0.7 roughly ETH, but the floor price at the moment is 1.4. Now, is anyone buying at that level? I don't really think so. One of the interesting things here is the liquidity of the project. So liquidity just means how many people are buying and selling. And actually, at the moment, there's not a lot going on. So again, I would say this is a high price. I wouldn't say you are guaranteed to be able to do this, but at the moment, that would be, what the math would say. And then the other really interesting thing is, if you wanted to have a little villain, create a little villain, the create cost would be, well, you have to buy a masked villain. But the floor price of the little villains is this. So, in fact, you would actually lose money. So if you were basically going to go and buy a masked villain to create a little villain, you've got a gas fee on top of that as well. So you actually would be losing money. So we actually have this slightly weird situation where we have all these masked villains. So we have about 6,000 left, according to OpenSea, from the 8,100 whatever. And you need one of those to make a supervillain. And if you make a supervillain, the floor price is high enough. So it's, okay, it costs a lot, 1.5 ETH. That's not nothing, mainly because you'll need to buy a supervillain potion. But that sort of trade seems logical. Although there are only this many potions left. Okay, so and if you want to create a big villain, then that sort of, at the moment, makes the most sense, partly because we're not quite sure this floor price is actually correct. But that sort of seems to make sense. Where it really doesn't make sense is we have these little villains, because at the moment, no one's sort of, why would you want to come in and buy one of these little villains? But equally, you have a different sort of mechanic here where people are trying to get rid of their masked villains. So at the moment, we have this sort of stasis where there's no profit to be made, so no one's going to be making these trades. If you want a masked villain, you're just going to buy a masked villain. You're not going to go through. So if you want a little villain, you'll just go and buy a little villain. You won't bother getting a masked villain and then paying the gas to do the process to mint one out, because there's no I think no real sort of interesting rarity there, because the interesting rarities is sort of defined by the potion. So we have this sort of slightly weird game theory where at the moment, there's not going to be, as far as I can see, unless the floor price for masked villains has to drop in order. Let's get this right. The floor price for masked villains has to drop, or the floor price for little villains has to rise. Because at the moment it just makes no sense. But at the moment, why would anyone want to buy a little villain? It's sort of unclear, because there's no sort of game around DigiDaigaku. We don't really know what the game is. Now that may change when the dragons come in. So we don't know. That's a lot of the uncertainty. But at the moment, you have this sort of slightly weird situation where for these rarer ones, people might be doing these trades. I don't think many people are, but you could imagine people are maybe doing those sort of trades because these assets look interesting. Then the other thing to think about is, what are people buying heroes? So heroes are obviously, there are potentially, there's only 2,000 compared to 8,000 of these masks of these villains. So if we look at all the villains that could be created, and we would assume at some point maybe this thing will unwind itself, and people will just be buying masked villains and minting them all out. But maybe it won't. So there is again uncertainty. We don't know how many villains are going to be created, but the potential is there's going to be many fewer heroes than villains. But heroes are only going for like 3.2 ETH. So that sort of gives us some idea of a sort of a price of the more expensive asset, the rarer asset. So supervillains, it seems unlikely they're going to go much higher than 2. If you say your heroes got floor of 3, supervillains floor of 2, there's things that's sort of psychological. Big villains, Big Brother, whatever they're called. Called Big Brother villains. I've just called Big them actually because called them Big there. Sort of that seems a bit high on the basis of that, but we know there's not going to be very many of them. So maybe it's not that ridiculous. And then we know there's going to be loads of these. So we sort of have this slightly weird sort of gearing problem, as I see it, where it's not very clear how what's going to happen to all these masked villains. Some of them people are going to use to do super villains and Big Brother villains, but Little Brother villains, it seems at the moment there isn't a lot of utility around that, and we can sort of see this again even with the so this is looking at the sort of trading around them. So there's been 24 ETH trading of supervillains, so that's about $40,000. There's been about $16,000 of trading villains, so just 30,000. That's not very much at all. If you consider these things, that's like about 10 sales. Oh no, well, okay, no, it will be more than that for the it depends on the ratio of big and little. The masked villains is where all the trading's happened. So there's been $2.8 billion worth at current ETH price at least. So most of the trading's happened around these masked villains. But probably, I mean, with the gearing around this, why would anyone be buying these? The majority of people are not going to be wanting to buy these because at the entry level you just buy the little villain. So we have this sort of slightly weird problem. There's a bit of stuff going on about super potions, but the potions, just the general potions, not a lot. Here, I think we have seen this before with some, not quite in the same way, but with some NFT sales where you have the ability to mint out at a mint price, and then the floor for the NFTs that have been already minted out drops below the mint price, and at that point, why would you mint it out at a higher price when you can buy it immediately off OpenSea at a lower floor price? So it's not quite the same, but it's sort of getting to that level where you sort of, why would you buy a masked villain to create a Little Brother villain when you can just buy a Little Brother villain? You can sort of choose the one you want, and there's not much. The rarity is not like you might be lucky and get a super rare one, because the super rare ones you have to have these other sort of potions in there. So it is sort of fascinating. And to say all this sort of stuff can change. Because this is a project that hasn't sort of told us anything about how these things are actually going to be used at the moment. They're just sort of assets that are sitting around there. We're thinking, we have no idea. Maybe the easiest way will be to say that these little villains, these Little Brother villains, are really useful because you use them in you have some sort of squad thing, so people then start buying them up. So we're in an information uncertain sort of world. But in terms of the numbers at the moment, it's looking there are some potentially obvious ways people would be trading these things in a way that would increase the value of their assets, i.e. buying a super villain potion and a masked villain. At least at this stage you wouldn't be losing money on that, whereas on some things you would do. And the interesting one, I guess, is this one here, where you're buying a masked villain fairly cheap, you're buying a villain potion, I mean relatively cheap, fairly cheap, and that's much cheaper to do than to buy at the floor price. So that would sort of be the incentivized option if you were interested in this sort of collection. So anyway, I probably spend much too much time thinking about this sort of stuff, and maybe I've got some fundamental bits wrong. I'm sure people will be pointing that out in the comments if I have done so. Anyway, I thought it was interesting. Hope you did too. See you next time.